I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound of my life being bartered away was not the dramatic clash of swords or the solemn pronouncement of a judge, but the rustle of silk and the clink of my mother's favorite teacup against its saucer. It was a sound of profound and suffocating domesticity. Lavinia must be in the jonquil silk. My mother's voice, crisp and certain, drifted into the hallway where I stood, a forgotten book pressed against my chest. It brings out the gold in her hair. We shall put her by the window, where the afternoon light will turn her into a veritable angel. There was a murmur of agreement from my sister, Lavinia, a soft, melodic sound that had always been her greatest asset. My sister was a creature woven from sunlight and honey, her laughter like wind chimes, her beauty a currency our family had been hoarding for a day just like this one. Today, the Duke of Alastair was coming to call. Today, our family's ruinous debts might be swept away by the sheer force of Lavinia's loveliness. "And Eleanor?" Lavinia asked. Her voice held a note of what might have been mistaken for concern, but I knew it for what it was, the reflexive politeness of a girl who had never had to be anything but kind, for the world had always been kind to her. A sigh from my mother, thin and sharp as a needle. "Eleanor will be in her gray muslin, in the corner, by the tea service. She can make herself useful for once." The words were not cruel in their delivery. They were worse. They were practical, dismissive, the verbal equivalent of sweeping dust into a corner where it would not be seen. I was the dust. I was the second daughter, the plain one, the one whose dowry had long since been absorbed by my father's catastrophic investments and whose quiet nature was read not as thoughtfulness, but as a lack of spirit. My worth was a ledger entry written in invisible ink. I did not move. I stood in the cool, dim hallway, the spine of the book digging into my palm, and I let the finality of it wash over me. I was not a participant in my own life. I was a piece of scenery, a prop to be positioned for the benefit of the principal actors. My father's ineffectual grief over our dwindling finances had curdled into a desperate gamble, and my mother, a woman of brittle smiles and iron ambition, was the architect of this final, desperate play. I was to be hidden, a quiet, gray smudge at the edge of Lavinia's brilliant tableau, lest my plainness tarnish the perfection of the offering. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath that did not fill my lungs, and retreated to the one place I was ever truly welcome, the silent, ordered world of my books. The Duke of Alastair arrived precisely at 3. He was not what I had expected from the hushed and fearful gossip that preceded him. The rumors painted him as a specter, a man hollowed out by the loss of his young wife years ago, his heart a cold, empty chamber. He was spoken of as severe, arrogant, and impossibly wealthy. He was all of those things, I supposed, but the reality of him was more complex. He entered our drawing room not with a flurry of aristocratic pomp, but with a stillness that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. He was tall, and the stark black of his coat made him seem like a figure cut from shadow and thrust into our world of fading gilt and anxious pastels. His face was a composition of harsh lines and controlled discipline, his expression unreadable, his eyes a gray so pale they seemed almost silver. My mother, her smile stretched taut across her face, performed the introductions. "Your Grace, may I present my daughter, Lavinia." Lavinia, positioned exactly as planned, was a masterpiece. The jonquil silk shimmered, and the slanted ribbons of light from the window caught the gold threads in her hair, haloing her in a manufactured divinity. She curtsied, a fluid, perfect motion, a porcelain doll on a velvet tray. The Duke inclined his head, a gesture so minimal it was almost an insult. His gaze swept over her, clinical and brief. It was not the look of a man enchanted. It was the look of a man inspecting a horse he was considering for purchase. My own introduction was an afterthought, a mumble from my mother as she gestured vaguely toward my corner. "And my other daughter, Eleanor." I was performing my assigned duty, my hands steady as I poured tea into a delicate china cup. I did not look up. I felt his eyes on me, but I refused to meet them. To be seen was to be judged, and I had been judged wanting my entire life. I finished my task, placing the cup on the silver tray. My focus narrowed to the tiny, painted violets on the porcelain. The silence stretched. The stilted conversation my mother attempted to initiate faltered and died. Then it happened. My father, attempting a witticism about the weather, gestured too broadly, and a small, leather-bound book of verse tumbled from a nearby side table, landing with a soft thud on the floor near my feet. Before I could even think to move, a dark shape blotted the light. The Duke had crossed the room in 2 silent strides and was stooping to retrieve it. As he straightened, his eyes met mine. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep he had given my sister, but a direct, unblinking appraisal. It was a look of startling intensity, sharp and analytical, as if he were trying to read the very thoughts from my mind. In that moment, I was not the gray smudge in the corner. I was the only person in the room. He saw the flush that crept up my neck, the way my fingers tightened on the edge of the tea table, the quiet defiance in my posture. He saw all of it, and he did not look away. He held the book for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn gilt on the spine, his gaze still locked with mine. A key turned in a lock I had not known was there. A sudden, jarring recognition that went beyond appearance, beyond station, beyond the carefully constructed stage of my mother's drawing room. The established social script, so meticulously written, had just been torn in two. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. "Petrarch," he said, not to my father, who had dropped it, but to me. A difficult passion. He placed the book not back on the table, but into my hands, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was a spark in the suffocating quiet, a tiny, brilliant shock. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of social niceties that felt hollow and absurd. The Duke's attention remained fractured. He would respond to my mother's questions, his gaze would rest politely on Lavinia, but then, inevitably, his eyes would find their way back to my corner, back to me. I felt it like a physical touch, a persistent, questioning pressure. When he finally took his leave, his bow to my mother and sister was correct, but as he passed me, he paused. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low and for my ears alone. "I trust you will not allow your service to the tea table to prevent you from finishing your book." It was not a compliment. It was a challenge, a quiet acknowledgement of the cage he had seen me in. My mother was furious. "What was that? What did he say to you?" she demanded the moment the front door closed. "You were meant to be invisible, Eleanor." "Not soliciting conversation." "He commented on my book, Mother," I replied, my voice even. "Insolence," she snapped, but her eyes were narrowed with a new, unwelcome calculation. The Duke had deviated from the script, and she did not know what it meant. For the first time, a flicker of something unfamiliar and dangerous sparked within me. Felt like hope. The Duke returned 3 days later. My mother, scrambling to regain control of the narrative, had Lavinia seated at the pianoforte, her fingers dancing over the keys in a melody that was both lovely and entirely devoid of feeling. I was once again relegated to a chair in the shadows, this time with a basket of mending, a task designed to broadcast my domestic utility and my lack of consequence. He entered, gave a curt nod to the room at large, and walked directly to my chair. "Miss Vance," he said, ignoring my mother's startled intake of breath and Lavinia's faltering notes. "Your father mentioned you are the curator of his library. I confess, the collection at Alastair House is more focused on agricultural treatises than on poetry. I was hoping you might be persuaded to show me your family's collection." It was a command disguised as a request. My mother's face was a mask of fury and confusion. The library was my sanctuary, a dusty, neglected room that smelled of aging paper and leather polish. It was the only place in the house I felt wholly myself. To have him invade it felt like a violation and, terrifyingly, an invitation. "Of course, Your Grace," I managed, setting the mending aside. My mother did not dare to contradict a duke, but the look she gave me promised retribution. Under the reluctant chaperonage of my mother, we walked to the library. The moment we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The Duke ran a hand along a row of spines, his posture losing some of its rigid formality. "It is a fine collection," he murmured, "if somewhat disorganized." "My father's passions are varied and his habits chaotic," I replied, the words coming more easily in this familiar space. "And yours?" he asked, turning to face me. The question hung in the air, a genuine inquiry that no one had ever bothered to ask me before. My mother hovered by the door, a thunderous cloud of disapproval. I hesitated, then found my courage. "I prefer order, Your Grace. Philosophy, the Stoics. The idea that one's inner state need not be dictated by external circumstance." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. "A difficult philosophy to practice." "Less difficult than the alternative," I countered quietly. From that point on, our conversations became the focal point of his visits. He would endure the requisite 10 minutes of pleasantries in the drawing room before engineering a reason to speak with me, often in the library. We spoke of Marcus Aurelius and of crop rotation, of Italian sonnets and the crippling cost of maintaining a slate roof. He discovered that I had read my father's books on estate management, not out of duty, but out of a desperate hunger for practical knowledge, for a world that operated on logic and consequence rather than the shifting whims of social favor. He listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that was both unnerving and deeply validating. He did not praise my intelligence with flowery compliments. He challenged it, he engaged with it, he treated it as a given. One brisk autumn afternoon, as we discussed a passage from Virgil, I shivered, a small, involuntary tremor in the chill of the underheated library. I saw him notice, but he said nothing, and the conversation continued. 2 days later, a package arrived from a London haberdashery. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a shawl of the finest, softest wool, the color of deep heather. There was no card, no note, no indication of the sender. But I knew. Kindness, I had learned, often comes with invisible invoices, a down payment on a future obligation. But this felt different. It was a silent, secret acknowledgement of a small, unmet need. It was an act of care, not of commerce. I wrapped it around my shoulders, and the warmth that spread through me had little to do with the wool. It was the warmth of being seen, not as a commodity, but as a person who could feel the cold. The tension between us grew, a fine, shimmering wire drawn taut in the quiet spaces of our conversations. Culminated one afternoon in the library. We were alone for a rare moment, my mother having been called away to deal with some household crisis. He was showing me a folio of architectural drawings, his and my heads bent close over the large page. As he turned the sheet, his hand brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch, but the air crackled. I pulled my hand back as if burned. He froze, his gaze lifting from the page to my face. The room was utterly silent, save for the frantic beating of my own heart. The space between us was charged, filled with everything we had not said, every rule we were breaking just by standing so close. He straightened slowly, putting a deliberate distance between us. The moment was broken, but the memory of it lingered, a phantom warmth on my skin. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had used my given name. It landed in the quiet room with the weight of a vow. "Forgive me. The constraints of this situation are trying. I find that addressing you as Miss Vance is becoming an impediment to honesty. I would ask that you call me Alistair, if you are willing." Alistair. The name felt foreign and momentous on my tongue. It was a crossing of a line, a deliberate step out of the rigid formations of society and into a new, uncharted territory that belonged only to us. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. In that moment, surrounded by the silent witness of 1,000 books, we were no longer a duke and a poor relation. We were a man and a woman, standing on the precipice of a terrifying and beautiful possibility. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day of dreary, persistent rain that matched the sudden chill in my soul. It was from my father's solicitor, addressed in a spidery, urgent script. I had been tasked with organizing the chaotic mess of my father's study, a penance for my perceived transgressions, and I found the letter tucked beneath a stack of unpaid bills. My first instinct was to leave it for him, but the solicitor's name was one I associated with the darkest clouds of our family's financial weather. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener, my hand trembling slightly. The words within were a catastrophe of ink and paper. They were not merely a summary of debts. They were a blueprint for a transaction. The solicitor wrote of a proposed agreement with the Duke of Alastair, a mutually beneficial arrangement to be finalized upon the Duke's satisfaction. The terms were laid out in cold, legal prose. In exchange for the hand of my sister, Lavinia Vance, in marriage, the Duke would assume and dissolve the entirety of the Vance family's considerable debts. My father had not been gambling. He had been selling his own daughter. Alastair's visit was not a courtship. It was an inspection. The room tilted. The books on the shelves seemed to blur, their wisdom turning to meaningless patterns. Every moment of the past few weeks replayed in my mind, twisted and poisoned by this new, horrifying context. The intense gaze in the drawing room, the conversations in the library, the shared intellectual spark, they were not genuine. They were the actions of a shrewd man assessing his purchase. The shawl, the warmth of it turning to ash on my shoulders, was not an act of secret kindness. It was a bauble, a minor expense to gentle the livestock. He had not been seeing me, Eleanor, the quiet girl in the corner. He had been amusing himself with a curious footnote while the main text of his business, Lavinia, was being evaluated. The intimacy of his name, Alastair, now felt like the grossest violation, a calculated move to disarm me, to make me a more pliable part of the bargain. I felt a fool, a naive, bookish girl who had mistaken a businessman's fleeting interest for something real. The hope that had flickered within me was extinguished, leaving behind a cold, bitter smoke. I did not weep. My grief was a hard, cold stone in my chest. I folded the letter, the sharp creases a mirror of the new, sharp edges of my heart, and I waited. I knew he would come that afternoon. When the maid announced his arrival, I did not wait to be summoned. I walked down the stairs, the letter held in my hand like a weapon. I met him in the hall, my mother and Lavinia hovering in the drawing-room doorway, their faces expectant. "Your Grace," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth, all familiarity. "May I have a word with you?" "In the library." His eyes narrowed, sensing the glacial shift in my demeanor. He gave a curt nod and followed me. The moment the library door closed behind us, I turned on him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The fury and betrayal I felt were a palpable force in the room. "I believe this belongs to you," I said, holding out the letter. "Or rather, it concerns a business arrangement you have undertaken with my father." He took the letter, his gaze flicking over the first few lines. His expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He looked from the paper to my face, and for the first time, he seemed to see the true depth of the chasm that had opened between us. "Was any of it real?" I asked, my voice a low, shaking whisper. "Our conversations? The books? Or was I simply a diversion? An interesting specimen you found pinned in a corner while you conducted your purchase of my sister?" He was silent for a long moment, his silver eyes searching my face. "The arrangement," he began, his voice careful, measured, "was the reason I agreed to come here. Yes, that is the truth." The stone in my chest fractured. "So it was all a lie?" "No," he said, taking a step toward me. I flinched back. "The arrangement was a distasteful necessity proposed by your father. I came to Blackwood Manor to assess the terms of a contract. That is what I told myself. I came to fulfill a duty to my name, to secure a neighboring estate through a convenient, if archaic, marital alliance. I expected to find a beautiful, empty-headed girl and a lifetime of polite misery." He paused, his gaze intense. "Everything else, you were a catastrophe I did not plan for. You were not part of the transaction, Eleanor. You were the one who made the transaction impossible." He confessed that he had known of the debt from the beginning, that it was the hook my father had used to lure him. But he had not been prepared for me. He admitted that his interest in me had started as mere curiosity, a puzzle to be solved. Why was this intelligent, observant woman hidden away like a shameful secret? But curiosity had deepened into respect, and respect into something more, something that had thrown his cold, ordered world into chaos. "Do you truly believe," he asked, his voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before, "that I would discuss Marcus Aurelius with a woman as a prelude to buying her sister? Do you think I am so depraved? So bored?" My anger began to waver, eroded by the sheer force of his sincerity. But the doubt remained, a toxic residue. "The shawl," I whispered. "The name. They were for you," he said simply. "They had nothing to do with your sister or your father or this damnable contract. They were for the woman who believes in the power of the inner state over external circumstance. The woman who shivered in a cold library." Then he revealed the final, crucial piece of his strategy. "I took action weeks ago," he stated, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command. "I settled your father's most pressing accounts with his creditors directly, anonymously. The debt that formed the basis of his contract with me no longer exists. I did it to sever the chains he was attempting to place on you, on me, on this entire sordid affair. I did it so that any choice made in this house would be a free one, not a transaction. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you, to tell your family. It seems you have forced my hand." He had not come to enforce a contract. He had come to dismantle one. He had acted not to secure his investment, but to protect me from being part of it. The foundation of my outrage crumbled, leaving me exposed and trembling. He closed the distance between us then, his hands coming up to gently cup my face. His touch was not proprietary. It was pleading. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "For years, my life has been a fortress, built to keep grief out, to keep duty in. It was a cold, orderly, and empty place. And then I walked into a drawing room to inspect a piece of property, and I found a woman in a gray dress in the corner who held more life and fire and intelligence in her little finger than the rest of the world combined. You did not just disrupt my plans. You unmade me. You are in my every thought. I do not want a beautiful bride to adorn my estate. I want a partner. I want an equal. I want you." It was a confession, a declaration, a plea. It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him, this severe, guarded man. The walls of his fortress had come down, and he was standing in the ruins, offering me his heart. The stone of my grief dissolved, replaced by a surge of feeling so powerful it left me breathless. It was a terrifying, exhilarating wave of love and relief. I looked into his eyes, those pale silver eyes that were no longer cold, but filled with a fierce, burning hope. "Alistair," I whispered, the name no longer a violation but a homecoming. In that moment, I knew his feelings were as genuine as my own. I knew we were no longer two separate people caught in a web of deceit, but allies, partners, united against the small, petty ambitions of my family. The battle was not over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. My mother, sensing her prize slipping through her fingers, grew desperate. The Duke's continued preference for me, the quiet revolutionary in gray, was an affront to her life's work. She could not comprehend a world where substance was valued over surface, where a library held more allure than a pretty face. In a final, audacious move to reclaim control, she planned a formal dinner party. It was to be a public spectacle, a stage upon which Lavinia's virtues would be paraded and my own inadequacies implicitly highlighted. It was an attempt to shame the Duke back into line, to remind him of his duty to convention and to the beautiful girl in jonquil silk. The evening was a masterpiece of passive aggression. I was seated at the farthest end of the table from the Duke, a deliberate geographical statement of my irrelevance. Lavinia, radiant in a gown of silver brocade, was placed at his right hand. The conversation was a carefully orchestrated symphony of praise for Lavinia's needlepoint, her watercolors, her flawless French accent. I was ignored so completely that my presence became a tangible void, a black hole of social disapproval. I ate my soup in silence, my composure a thin, brittle shield. Across the glittering expanse of silver and crystal, I could feel Alistair's frustration, a tightly coiled spring of anger beneath his ducal calm. He answered the sycophantic questions directed at him with monosyllabic curtness, his eyes repeatedly finding mine down the long table, a silent communication of shared endurance. The breaking point came with the dessert. My mother, emboldened by wine and the seeming success of her social maneuvering, decided to press her attack. She set down her wine glass with a delicate click that drew all eyes. "It is such a comfort, Your Grace," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "to know that old families like yours still value propriety. In these modern times, one sees so many unsuitable alliances, so much grasping." She flicked a venomous glance in my direction. "It is a mother's greatest fear that a daughter might, through ambition or delusion, attempt to entrap a man so far above her station. Thankfully, with a girl as well-bred and beautiful as Lavinia, we have no such concerns. Our agreement, after all, was always clear." The air grew thick with unspoken accusations. The guests shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer a dinner party. It was an execution. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, the familiar sting of humiliation. But before the shame could take root, something new and hard and clear rose in its place. It was the echo of Alistair's confession, the memory of his raw sincerity. "You unmade me." Alistair calmly placed his fork and knife on his plate, the silver making a quiet, definitive sound against the porcelain. He turned his body slightly, not to my mother, but to address the entire table. "Lady Vance speaks of agreements," he said, his voice dangerously soft, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "And it is true, Lord Vance and I did have a business discussion, a matter of some outstanding debts." My father blanched, his face turning the color of old parchment. My mother's smile froze. "However," Alistair continued, "that business was concluded some weeks ago." Independently, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document, placing it on the table beside his plate. "As a gesture of neighborly goodwill, and in recognition of our family's long history in this county, I took the liberty of purchasing a small, solvent property and signing the deed over to Lord Vance. It should be more than sufficient to ensure his family's comfort and security." He paused, letting the implications settle. "There is no debt. There is no obligation. There is no agreement." A collective, soft gasp went around the table. He had not just refuted my mother. He had publicly exposed the sordid, desperate transaction at the heart of her ambition, and then, with a flick of his wrist, nullified it. He had taken away her only weapon. It was in that moment of stunned silence that I found my own voice. I pushed back my chair and stood. All my life I had been silent, invisible, but I was invisible no longer. I looked not at the stunned guests, but directly at my mother, the architect of my long diminishment. "You speak of entrapment, mother?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying the resonant clarity of truth. "But the only trap in this house is the one you built yourself. A trap of vanity and ambition, where a daughter's worth is measured only by the quality of her face and the title of the man she can procure." I took a breath, the air tasting of freedom. "My worth is not determined by my dowry, or my seat at this table, or your approval. It is determined by my character, by my mind, by my integrity. These are concepts I fear you have long since forgotten." I let my gaze fall to Lavinia, who looked pale and shaken, a doll whose strings had just been cut. Then I looked back at my mother. "I do not feel anger toward you. I feel only pity. Pity for your blindness. Pity for the beautiful, empty world you have built for yourself." It was not a shout. It was not a tantrum. It was a quiet, precise dismantling of her entire worldview. The social humiliation was absolute. The guests stared at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at my mother's crumbling facade or my father's slack-jawed horror. The grand matriarch had been exposed as a common horse trader, and her schemes had turned to dust in her hands. Without another word, Alistair rose from his chair and came to my side. He did not touch me, but his presence was a shield, a declaration. "I believe, Miss Vance," he said formally, for the benefit of the room, "that the air in here has become rather oppressive. Perhaps a walk in the garden is in order." He offered me his arm. I took it, and together, we walked out of the dining room, leaving the wreckage of my family's ambitions behind us. The night air was cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and late-blooming roses. A sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over the garden paths. We walked in silence, the crunch of gravel under our feet the only sound. He led me away from the house, away from the judgmental glare of its windows, to a small, secluded stone bench overlooking the dark, rolling hills of the estate. The tension of the dining room slowly uncoiled from my shoulders, replaced by a profound and trembling sense of release. He turned to me, his face shadowed and serious in the moonlight. "Eleanor," he began, but I stopped him. "Thank you," I whispered. "You gave me a voice tonight." "No," he corrected, his voice low and intense. "I did not give it to you. You have always had it. I only gave you a reason to use it." He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The gesture was infinitely tender, a stark contrast to the harsh lines of his face. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us, to the warmth of his skin against mine, to the deep, unspoken understanding that flowed in the quiet. All the subtext, all the charged moments, all the secret kindnesses and intellectual sparks had led to this. "I have been a fool," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "A man content to live in a fortress of his own making. I thought honor and duty were enough. I thought control was the same as peace. You have shown me how wrong I was. True peace, I think, is not found in solitude. It is found in being truly seen by another." And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a polite, chaste kiss. It was a kiss of profound and shattering intensity, slow and deep and shaking with all the emotion we had held in check for so long. It was a release of tension, a confirmation of love, a sealing of a pact made not with contracts and solicitors, but in the quiet of a dusty library and the courageous space of a vulnerable heart. It was the taste of homecoming. It was the end of a life spent in the corner and the beginning of a life in the light. In his arms, under the silent witness of the moon, I was no longer the plain sister, the forgotten daughter. I was simply Eleanor, and it was at last enough. 3 months later, I stood not in a corner, but at the center of the grandest library I had ever seen. Sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny, dancing diamonds. The scent of old leather and beeswax and wood smoke was the scent of my own home. I was Eleanor, Duchess of Alistair, and the quiet awe of it still ambushed me at unexpected moments. I ran my hand along a row of books, their spines a warm, familiar texture under my fingers. This was my sanctuary, my domain, a world of thought and history that was now mine to curate and to share. A pair of strong arms wrapped around me from behind, and a familiar chin rested on my shoulder. "Hiding from your ducal duties already, wife?" Alistair's voice was a low rumble against my ear, laced with an amused tenderness that had become my favorite sound. I leaned back against him, my heart settling into its familiar rhythm next to his. "I am not hiding," I corrected softly. "I am taking inventory. I have found a first edition of Seneca that I believe you have overlooked." He chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that still felt like a small miracle. "And I have found a wife who would rather catalog my library than plan a ball. I believe I am the most fortunate man in England." He turned me in his arms, his expression losing its playful edge, becoming sincere. "Are you happy here, Eleanor?" I looked up at him, at the man who was no longer a severe, intimidating duke but simply my husband. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the guardedness in his silver eyes replaced by a steady, unwavering affection. "Alistair," I said, my hand coming up to touch his cheek, "I have never known what it felt like to be home until now." A letter had arrived that morning on heavy cream stationery. It was from Lavinia. After the disastrous dinner party, she had finally broken from the toxic influence of our parents, taking refuge with a distant, kind-hearted aunt in the countryside. Her letter was not one of duty, but of genuine contrition and affection. She wrote of her shame at her own passive complicity, of the relief she felt at being free from the pressure of being a living commodity. In a postscript, she added that she had made the acquaintance of a local gentleman, a man with a modest estate and a passion for botany, who seemed more interested in her thoughts on perennial flowers than the color of her hair. For the first time, she was being seen for more than her beauty, and she was, she wrote, surprisingly happy. I felt a quiet joy for her, a hope that she too would find a home built on truth instead of tinsel. I looked from my husband's beloved face to the endless rows of books, the firelight gleaming on the gold-leaf titles, the whole vast, quiet room that was ours. My entire life, I had felt like a footnote in a story that was not my own, a character sketched in faint pencil at the edge of a vibrant page. I was the girl in the gray dress, the shadow in the corner, waiting for a life that seemed to be happening to everyone else. But a single glance had changed the narrative. One man's gaze, not of assessment but of inquiry, had been a question, and my entire life since had become the answer. He had not rescued me from the corner. He had simply been the first person to ever truly look there. And in being seen, I had found the strength not just to step out of the shadows, but to walk into the light and claim it as my own. He had come to my family's crumbling house to fulfill a duty, but in its quietest corner, he had found his Duchess. And I, in the heart of his fortress, had finally, blessedly, found my home.